Okay, hello. Uh, Good morning, everybody. Welcome to fifth semester. As you all are well aware, going to start off all classes online, and after a few days or weeks, we will reevaluate. College will reevaluate based on the situation, and then we will see how everything goes. And until then, we will be meeting through this online platform. This course, CMOS VLSI Design EC52. Um, we're teaching this version. Of course, we've been teaching this for a long time, but this version of the course is being taught for the first time. And it's also accompanied by a very nice book, as you can see on the right hand side of the screen. CMOS VLSI Design by Neil West and David Harris. And this also will form the textbook for this course. There are some reference books also. We'll share that with you later on. And in terms of the format, first one or two classes we will do it in online format, and the rest of this thing we will have classroom recordings, which we will play it to you. And those classroom recordings uh, are going to be done in the old Blackboard fashion, and they will also form the notes for this course. So please be aware that there are no separate notes. Whatever material, PPTs, whatever classroom we are doing, those form the notes along with the textbook. Okay. So since we are starting completely online, until we can meet face to face, we just wanted to introduce ourselves. There will be two teachers who are teaching this course. Dr. V. Anande, specialization is low power VLSI design, and I'm Dr. Raghuram S, specialization also VLSI design. We will be co-teaching this course, and each of us will be handling the full course in equal parts. Okay, and emails are below. You can of course contact us anytime you want on the email IDs that you see there, regarding any other information you want with respect to VLSI, with respect to this course, etc. Eventually, in a few days, we will also start a small course website where we can have more discussions. We'll share the notes, whatever we have, etc. Okay, and the first few weeks, at least till the situation improves, will be completely online itself. So please feel free to stop us whenever you want, uh, and whatever doubts you have, you can either ask it in the chat window, or you can switch on your video and mic, or whatever way you want, and you can ask it during the class itself. You don't have to wait till the end of the class. It'll also be nice to get some feedback from the students during the class time to make it a little more realistic instead of just running the video from beginning to end. So please feel free to ask whatever questions you want, either in the chat window, or you can ask it using your microphone also. Okay, so the first few uh, topics before we start, I just wanted to introduce you to the domain of VLSI. Since it's a new domain for you, we just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of this domain before we go into the actual lecture. So the first 1 hour or so will be just about the history of this particular domain. So, of course, I'm sure many of you know by now, but if not, the full form of VLSI is a very large scale integration. Okay, and this introduction is also kind of an answer to the question, what exactly is this VLSI? Hopefully, you'll also find out why you're learning it and what sort of companies are involved, what sorts of jobs are there, etc., for graduating engineers also. So we'll start with a little bit of real history. Much before the VLSI term was even coined, the real equations that The VLSI, of course, is a technology. What are the equations? We have differential equations, we have partial differential equations, we have many types of equations, right? And in digital logic, we have a completely different set of equations. We cannot deal with linear algebra, we cannot deal with anything else except the type of algebra which is now commonly known as Boolean algebra. And you see the picture here of the person George Boole, who invented Boolean algebra. And of course, we don't have a real picture because he invented it in the 1800s. And of course, he also knew nothing about computers, etc. It was just as a reasoning system using values that could have only yes or no answers. That is, variables that could have only yes or no as the values. So if two variables are both yes, then the resultant is yes. If one variable is yes, one variable is no, then what is the resultant? Those sort of investigations led him to come up with this very nice formulation, which today, of course, we know it very well as Boolean algebra. And it was there for a while. People couldn't do much with it until much later in the 1900s, around 1930 or so, came along this very, very, very smart and very, very active engineer, more a scientist, of course, Claude Shannon. And for ECE people especially, so our branch is electronics and communication. Shannon is a very, very important figure because he has made very seminal contributions to both electronics and communication. So in the electronics part is what we are involved with here. He proposed to use Boolean algebra to develop what are called as switching circuits. So the switch is a yes or no relation. It can be on or it can be off. There's no other in between mode of operation. So he said that using just switching circuits, you can make very complicated machines. So doing not complicated, complex rather. So that was his contribution to the electronic side. And later on, maybe in information theory and communication, when you come to that subject in the seventh semester, you will come back to the name Shannon, and he has made a lot of seminal contributions in the domain of communications as well. So Shannon and Boolean algebra together formed the foundations for modern computing systems, digital computing systems. Digital computing systems are by far the most popular. We have many types of computing systems today, many types of systems rather, but the computation part in all those systems is still done through basic digital circuits. There's no other way complex computations are done. So this is the start, and this contribution by Shannon led to this very important conclusion that any digital circuit can be built with just switches. So that's what he basically showed. It was actually his master's thesis that showed this particular fact, that we can build very complex digital computing machines, and they use Boolean algebra. And Boolean algebra, the variable is on or off variable, a yes or no variable, and they can be built with switches. So what he called as switching circuits can be used to build very complex digital computing machines. And that was around in the 1930s, and slowly that evolved into what we now know as the first digital computer. It was called as the Harvard Mark V, and that's what you see in this picture. Uh, the actually here, even though the switches are there in the overall circuit, what you see here in the front of this machine are just the interconnections. So all the people standing there, they are responsible for the connections, and the connections of course determine the function, and the switches are actually behind. We don't see the switches in this picture. The switch at this point of time was the vacuum tube, and the vacuum tube was a bulky. So for example, a vacuum tube would be a little bigger than a 1 liter water bottle, those vacuum tubes, very bulky systems, very large systems, and those about a few issues. One is it's almost a mechanical device. So mechanical devices are not very reliable. They often fail. Second problem is the size. Always mechanical devices occupy more space. They're more bulky and they don't scale well. So that is the second problem. And the third problem is the lifetime of mechanical devices because of wear and tear, etc. They are very low. So vacuum tube is not a real mechanical device, but it still was very bulky and it often could fail. One of the terms in computer science, for example, a program with an error is called as a bug. That came from this problem with vacuum tubes, because many times the vacuum tube is fine, but it's not working properly because some insect has gotten into the tube, and when it's supposed to be conducting, it's not conducting because the insect is blocking the circuit. So insect, another name for insect is bug. So you have to go find the bug, meaning you have to find where is that actual insect. And even though we don't have insects anymore inside computers, maybe cockroaches, but that's a different problem. But the term still stuck. So that was some of the issues with vacuum tubes. And since the invention of the computer, the digital computer, one of the most important aspects that we have continued to focus on is the transistor. So the transistor today, in digital circuits at least, it has only one function. The digital circuit could have 1 billion transistors, it could have 2 billion transistors, it doesn't matter. The transistor has only one particular function, and that is to act as a switch. That means it will either be on or it will be off. That's all it does. The original switching circuits that we discussed, they're exactly the same, still being used today, no change at all. So the only thing that is evolved, in fact, if you want to say what is the history of VLSI, you can actually track it very well if you track the history of the transistor, because as the transistor has evolved, the domain of VLSI has also evolved. Okay, so start at the beginning. On the left hand side, you see the first um transistor that was used in the digital computer. This is actually not the first transistor that was invented. There was a transistor invented earlier by Lilienfeld around 1930s, which is actually more similar to what we are using in the modern day transistor thing. This was, however, the first transistor that was used in a digital computer. That is an electronic transistor, replacing the vacuum tube that we talked about. And this is very similar to what you might have learned in one of the earlier subjects in first or second year electronics, which you might have been calling as the BJT, or the bipolar junction transistor. So this transistor you see on the left hand side is not exactly the BJT, but its functionality is very similar to the BJT. And you don't get a size of the scale, but this is approximately, the whole structure is about 1 feet in height. So even though it was the first transistor, even though they got the Nobel Prize for this particular work, it's still a very, very, very large structure compared to modern circuits. So this was around the 1940s again, maybe late 1940s, when they invented this transistor. And on the right hand side, a few years later, you see this is a picture of the first integrated circuit. We're going to see what is the meaning of this integrated in more detail, but this is an invention for which also Nobel Prize was given. So two very important contributions related to transistors and integrated circuits, and both of them got the Nobel Prize. So this is around the 1950s. So like I said, evolution of VLSI is very similar to the evolution of the transistor, and there's a small asterisk there. computer aided design also is very important, because whenever computers can do something, it makes things easier for the evolution of that particular domain. So which is why I mentioned that as a small asterisk. It's not that just the transistor has been evolving continuously and VLSI has been evolving. There is a separate domain which is called as VLSI, computer aided design. This has been popular since around 1980s, when things got too big for manual design, and this particular domain also has contributed largely to the rapid, of course VLSI evolved as many other fields have evolved, but a rapid evolution has been aided by improvements in the transistor and also improvements in the domain which is called as VLSI CAD. And here on the left hand side you will see a picture. This is a picture of a modern transistor. It doesn't look anything like what we are going to draw in the course, but still if you look deep into the picture you'll get an idea of the dimensions that we are talking about. Okay, so we'll come back to the structure later on. So a little bit about the important um, points in the history of this particular domain. Starting off way back early 1800s, first semiconductor effect. So that's one thing that's very seminal to VLSI is the semiconductor. Metal is not so important, metal is there, but everything is semiconductors. And what is this semiconductor? We will see, of course, but you can see the text there. It says electrical conduction increasing with temperature. So this is something different from metals, where the conductivity actually reduces with temperature because of some effects. But here in these particular elements, we saw that the increase was able to increase the effect of the conduction. That is the property which we call as conductivity. And much later after that, we see the first point contact rectifier. So if you remember your PN junction, also acts as a rectifier, that is allows current to flow only in one direction. So this discovery was the earlier version of the PN junction, where you have not a PN junction, but only one side is the semiconductor, other side is a metal. So there also we notice a similar type of effect where conduction happens only in one direction, either from the metal to the semiconductor or semiconductor to the metal, but not both. So that type of contact is also called as a point contact rectifier, and that was discovered around 1874. So slowly the properties of semiconductors are being understood better and better. And you see the scale. Okay, you see the where the first few decades the science was more important because nothing was known. But once the science was known, maybe around the 1940s, technology became more important. And you'll see that technology, the inventions are at a rapid pace compared to science, where it's more difficult to see how we can go from one point to the next point. So you see a Indian connection also here. Radio pioneer Jagdish Chandra Bose, not SN Bose, JC Bose, um, where the crystal rectifier, this is where again the PN junction type properties are being used for detecting radio waves. And this 1926 was the field effect semiconductor, where our modern transistor is also what we are going to call as a metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. So BJT is not a field effect transistor, it's a different type of technology. So field effect transistor was originally idea was contributed to Jules Lilienfeld, where you have this patent for a 3 electrode type device. And our transistor also, there are 3 main terminals, so very similar to what was done earlier. But because of the invention of the point contact transistor, this was more popular, so which evolved into the BJT before the metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor made a comeback. Okay. So you see before that we see the PN junction being discovered here and diode rectifiers, etc. And finally in 1947, there are 3 people, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and there's one more person also. Together, they all three received the Nobel Prize for the invention of the point contact transistor in 1947. And eventually, many products also started appearing, and many of these companies are not even there today. The first few companies that made all these semiconductor properties, for example, one very popular company was called Raytheon Semiconductor, which was eventually went into aircraft electronics and then finally got dissolved, etc. You might have heard one particular tube light company in India called as Lakshman Sylvania, which is probably not there now, but earlier Sylvania Semiconductor used to make semiconductors. So there are a lot of companies which started this commercial making of products based on transistors, all completely, of course, in the United States at that point of time. And Bell Labs, also where the transistor was invented, licenses the transistor technology, and slowly it evolves, and we see some more steps here in this 1954, this diffusion process. It's still the way in which the transistors are made, uh, not in all places, but we'll see that there's a more modern way of making it. But this diffusion name is going to be very important, because the region, even in today's transistor, even in our course, the region where the terminals of the transistor sit are called as diffusion region, and that is because the way in which the terminals were made was a process called as the diffusion, and this was invented as early as 1954. And 55 and 56, we see some of the things that are used to still today. Photolithography, which we will see in more detail in Unit 1. Basically, lithography is nothing but writing, and photolithography means writing with light. And this is the process that is still used in creation of semiconductors. And oxide mask, we will see more about a mask when we come to it later in this unit. And this is one very interesting thing. One of the earlier materials was germanium. Germanium is also a semiconductor which was used to make the transistors in 1947, the one that got the Nobel Prize. And later on, they slowly moved to silicon. So if that move hadn't come, it would have been called Germanium Valley, I guess. Bangalore would be India's Germanium Valley, but thankfully they shifted to silicon as the base material for the semiconductor. And of course, it started with the region which we now know very well as Silicon Valley, all around the San Francisco Bay Area. And very shortly after that, the first solid circuit or the solid state circuit or the integrated circuit was invented in 1958 by Jack Kilby from Texas Instruments. And eventually, silicon took over completely, like you see in the first point there, by Seymour Cray. Cray also made the first supercomputer, and there was also a company called Cray Machines for a long time before it got dissolved. And ICs, once they started being fabricated, became part of many industries. Aerospace, the first, mainly because aerospace likes lighter things, aerospace likes more reliability, etc. So aerospace company was very interested in semiconductor based devices. Even today, ISRO in India is rapidly adopting embedded systems for all of its components. One of the most fastest emerging fields is automotive embedded systems in India, especially where uh, there are more integrated circuits on your car as compared to your computer. And this is true. This is true even for mid-level cars, maybe not for the low-end Maruti, but as you go into higher and higher end cars, there are more electronic controls. The engine, of course, is a completely mechanical device. No one said that engine is electronic, except in electric cars. But in the rest of the this thing, there is so much electronics. And what is the advantage of this electronics is it makes diagnosis easier. What does that mean? For example, I have, say, many functionalities in my car. And what I do is everywhere I place very simple sensors. and I have what is called as a ECU, which is an integrated circuit called as the engine control unit. And this ECU is continuously, as the car is functioning, the ECU is receiving continuous reports from all the sensors. So say suddenly your car breaks down somewhere, or you take it in for service, for just a regular service. The mechanic, instead of checking each and every part in your car, he just has to remove the ECU and download the data from the ECU and see what has been going on with all the parts just by running a simple program. And the program will check all the parts automatically. It knows what all the normal signals need to be. Only the signals where it notices some abnormality, it will report only those signals, and directly the mechanic just needs to check those. He doesn't have to check the whole car. So a lot of things can be made simpler. You cannot change the functionality of the engine, that is still the same, but you can improve a lot of things. That is one very important aspect. And the other aspect, of course, as you might have noticed, the whole dashboard is becoming more and more electronic. All the olden style mechanical speedometer, you don't see in even two-wheelers, forget four-wheelers. The whole dashboard is just a screen, a touch screen. Your front window, front windshield also is going to access the infotainment system. Automotive electronics is growing at a very large pace, and it all started with the adoption of integrated circuits. We'll continue with our own history that we were seeing here. So we see this introduction. So you might have seen TTL, or transistor logic, when you were working with BJT circuits. Earlier to that even was DTL, which is diode transistor logic, where this is basically a way to make integrated circuits using some very simple rules. You can make very large circuits. And up to this point, up to 1960s, the ruler in the transistor technology was the PN junction diode, of course, for some circuit, but transistor as such was the BJT, or bipolar junction transistor. And slowly we moved on from BJT to what we see here, 1963, what is called as the complementary MOS circuit configuration, complementary metal oxide semiconductor. And there is a very important reason. So even though 1964 you see here, but it's not like immediately in 1965 BJT got kicked out and people only used MOS transistors. MOS transistors were the most important family of, sorry, BJT transistors were very, very important until the maybe 1970s or 1980s. And the reason why we switched now today, if you look at most 99% of the integrated circuits, they are made using this complementary metal oxide semiconductor CMOS circuit. And these are there for a reason, and the reason is related to leakage current. And if you see the structure, you will understand that better. But for now, just remember that the reason why BJTs are faster. Nobody can claim even today that MOS is faster than BJT transistor. And we will see what is the meaning of fast, because so far we're just saying that transistor is a switch, but there is some importance of speed also. And BJT is actually faster than MOS transistor. But the problem is BJT has a very significant leakage current. And if you're using 10 or 20 transistors, it makes no difference. But if you're using 10 lakh or 1 crore transistor, the leakage current of all of them gets added up. So that makes a huge significant reduction in your battery power very quickly. So that is why BJT transistors are no longer used in any of the modern circuits. They're still used, of course, in some high-end communication circuits, etc. But most commercial digital integrated circuits depend completely on MOS transistors. So MOS transistors are so good even today that they are used like 1964 here. You see first widely used analog integrated circuits. So digital is of course the beginning, but analog is also there today. And all of them use mostly MOS circuits. And you have this very nice picture of the final what we have seen in maybe digital electronic circuits lab. where we see the actual integrated circuit with its packaging, which is called as dual inline packaging or DIP. And this is the form of the transistor or integrated circuit that we know. And this is very familiar picture to us of integrated circuit. And this was the state of the art in 1965, dual inline package. And also we see the last point here of the history, at least, what is called as Moore's law, which is one of the, it's like a very, very important statement for the VLSI industry. And this was predicted by Gordon Moore, who was the, it says Fairchild here, but I don't know, maybe he was with Intel, I'm not very sure, but around 1965, which is just a few years, not even one full decade of integrated circuits. But his prediction was that integrated circuits will grow at a particular rate, and he gave a statement that gave us that rate. He said that number of transistors on an integrated circuit will double every 18 months. So that's what he predicted. uh, I'm pretty sure he also didn't imagine that, two things. One is it would become so popular, but also that it would become so important, what he said. And today, it's been going on since 1965. We are in 2020 now, so it's about 35 plus 50, about 55 years since he said this. And it's still true. If you look at the evolution of modern transistors, you still see that the number of transistors on the integrated circuit has been doubling at approximately 18 months to 2 years, give or take a few months, without anybody trying. It's not like somebody is trying to meet Moore's law. It's just the rate at which the quality of the transistor, it's the rate at which the requirements of the industry, it's the rate of requirement of the consumer rather, are developing along with the R&D abilities of the industry. They've been continuously able to meet this particular target. So we'll see some numbers also of number of ICs on the transistor. But this is a very, very important law that is almost like a God's rule for VLSI industry. So we look at, like I said, in my opinion at least, tracking the history of the transistor also very nicely tracks the history of VLSI itself. So here we will just track the history of transistor. What are the things that have been changing starting from around 1970s when we settled into the modern transistor. Maybe BJT somewhere in 1970s, somewhere it switches to MOS, doesn't matter, but it's a switch. Right now in 1970s, 80s, etc., we are looking at the transistor as a switch. So if you look at the first block around 1970s, we are in the domain of we are not yet at the modern, what we call as modern VLSI. It's MSI or more medium scale integration. Earlier to this was small scale integration where even fewer transistors were there. But at this point of time, around 2,500 transistors they were able to put on one single integrated circuit. Okay, so that is the first thing. A second thing is about 10 micrometer. This is the size of what is the size of a transistor? We'll of course look into this at much more detail, but just a number, it was around 10 micrometers in the 1970s, and $1 per transistor. So if you had to buy a 2,500 transistor IC, it might have cost you around 2,500 US dollars. Of course, it was much higher than that because there are other, that's just the fabrication cost of the transistor. You have many more things like interconnection, you have amortized cost, you have engineer cost, you have design cost, you have advertisement costs. So many more are there. But the transistor itself was about $1 per transistor. VDD, the power supply voltage. Modern devices are much lower, but no transistor work on our. Generally, you can't plug a transistor into 220 volts and expect it to work. It works at a much lower voltage. The power supply voltage, even your computers, you have an adapter and the actual power supply you give to the computer is around 5 volts, and that gets converted further before it goes to the PCB. But at 1970s, the actual voltage given to the transistors was around 10 volts. And the clock frequency, this is very interesting today. You can't do much with a 1 kilohertz clock today, but then state of the art was around 1 kilohertz clock. And slowly that evolved over the next decade. You see the number of transistors jumping from 2500 to around 10,000 per integrated circuit. Size is reduced drastically, almost 10 times it is reduced from 10 micrometer to just 1.5 micrometer. Cost is reduced 1,000 times, $1 per transistor to just 0.001 per transistor. Okay, and this is how your sales, etc., translate into reduced cost. You sell more today, and some of that money goes back into research and development. And if you have more and more money going into research and development, the cost of the product actually reduces, and that's what we are seeing here also. And one interesting fact, and this is true even today, is who are the drivers of this industry? The giant, it's a huge multi-billion dollar industry spanning the whole world. Everybody buys them, everybody uses them. But what is the group of people who actually contribute most sales revenue to this VLSI industry? That's a very interesting answer. It's not the research scientist sitting in our research labs or sitting in ISC, or it's not the home computer users who have a desktop for their children, or it's not any of those people. It's actually the person who is playing the video game. The video gamers, they always, the quality of the rendering is very important to them, and because of which they always want to stay at the state of the art. If there is a, of course today we have the GPU, but the CPU is also important. But if they have a more modern system, they'll quickly sell their older computer and buy that one, compared to the home computer user who might stick with the same. I'm sure most of your computers, on average, not everybody's, but on average, you might keep it for 4 to 5 years at least before you do anything to it, before you add some RAM or before you change to solid state drive. Whatever you do, you might keep it for 4 to 5 years. But if you look at the average computer game user, you'll never sit with the same this thing for more than 2 years. So the actual drivers of this VLSI industry is the person playing the computer game, not the scientist or not the home user. So if anybody playing computer games extensively out there, thanks a lot to you. Okay, please continue playing also. So continuing with our this thing, power supply is also reduced to 5 volts. Another question you might ask, what is the deal with power supply? Who cares about that? 10 volts is fine. I'm getting 220 volts. So why would we go from 10 volts to 5 volts? But power supply has a very, very important connection to power dissipation also. The more you supply, the more heat the integrated circuit also generates, and you see where this heat, etc., comes from. But it's very important that we maintain the power supply at a low level, so that the power consumption also stays at a low level. And this means that the biggest problem today is most people rely on a battery. If everybody always was connected to a power supply, then this wouldn't be an issue. But if you look at your own usage, you have a laptop, maybe you have a mobile phone, they all depend on the battery. The battery has to be charged. So the more power it consumes, the quicker your battery gets discharged. That is why this reducing power supply is also very important. And to come to around 1990, the year in which many of you, the decade in which many of you might have been born, making about 1 lakh transistors inside every integrated circuit, the transistor has finally gone into the nanometer range. You see here also, the reduction is sort of gradual. Like you can't reduce this by 1,000 times because we are at a very uh, small size, and it gets more and more difficult with the technology effects, etc. The cost is still reducing rapidly. It is reduced again by 1,000 times to 1 e⁻⁻⁶ per transistor. Power supply has not gone even half. It has gone from 5 to 3 volts. Clock supply has increased by 1,000 times to 100 kilohertz to 100 megahertz. Continuing, we see beginning of the modern VLSI era with about 1 million transistors in every integrated circuits. Transistor has gone deep into the nanometer region. It's 130 nanometer. The beginning of 2000s, transistor cost has become almost zero. Cost is dominated by other things such as the design cost and advertising cost, etc. And this is very true. Someone who was giving us a talk the other day from MediaTek, he gave us an example of a high-end phone where the cost of the core integrated circuit is not even 1% of the phone cost. So the phone is costing 1000 US dollars, which is a very high-end Apple or Samsung phone. The cost of the integrated circuit, which is made by Qualcomm, is not even 10 US dollars. It's a very pitiable cost, but that is the advantage of the VLSI industry. They have rapidly evolved so quickly that right now cost is very, very, very significantly low, which means that we can focus on other things. And the clock has finally reached 1 gigahertz. Around the turn of the century, we were at 1 gigahertz. Intel Pentium was the most popular. Uh, I think around 2000, I think it was P3, Pentium 3. And you can also look at a slightly different picture. We saw the evolution of the transistor, but there's also a parallel this thing which we can see, which is the evolution of the integrated circuit. So this is again very closely related, but here we are just looking at what sort of things that are being applied where ICs are being used. And 1950, of course, 1958 was the year it got the Nobel Prize for the invention of the integrated circuit. 1950 to 70 was the age of the large-scale integration. Intel, the giant today, was founded around mid-1960s, and the first integrated circuit was also made by Intel. It's called as Intel 4004. It had around 10,000 transistors, and VLSI courses were also slowly beginning to be taught in universities and colleges, so there was more and more students. And these are the students who form the backbone of the early VLSI industry and start slowly moving on into commercial adoption of ICs in older English or even Indian movies, Kannada, Hindi movies. You might see the black rotary phone where inside the phone everything was mechanical devices. Around 1980s, our uh, ITI, which is Indian Telephone Industry, started adoption of integrated circuits. So today, if you go to BSNL and you get a landline, it's very similar to what you would have got in 1980. You won't get the rotary phone anymore, but you will get a phone which is having a PCB and it has the integrated circuit sitting on the PCB. So there's no communication circuitry, of course, because you get it through a wire, but all the functionality is based on integrated circuits. And of course, the desktop PCs. Apple, I think, was among the first companies that made a simple desktop PC, and then slowly Microsoft took over, and the rest of that story. And also VLSI CAD, as the size became larger. If you started looking at a circuit more than 10,000 transistors, very difficult to predict the properties or even create the circuit for that matter. Forget the properties. Very difficult even to create such a large circuit. So we needed some computer tools to effectively create, not just create. Okay, you can't. It's not like you're just creating a painting or a drawing. It's also that you have to use the tools to actually make the circuit better. You are doing something by hand. If the computer can do it better, then why not let it do it better, right? So that is one of the most important aspects of computer-aided design. uh, have a lot of algorithms, have a lot of not intelligence. We're not talking about intelligence here. The traditional algorithms, maybe in FOC You might have learned of things like shortest path algorithm. All these sort of algorithms are used to make the VLSI design process more efficient, and that is completely dominated by the VLSI CAD companies. And as we have just mentioned, also um, adoption has increased beyond desktop computers. Today, of course, mobile phones, automotive. The next big thing uh, that we are coming up today is you might have heard of this neuromorphic computing.